Okay, good afternoon, and again, welcome to our discussion today. We are incredibly timely with the discussion on interprovincial trade barriers, not least because we are following the Premier, but obviously after many points of discussion this morning around reducing non-tariff barriers to trade, making a single economy in Canada, ensuring recognition of professional qualifications, licensing, and regulations across the country. All of this sounds lovely and easy in the abstract, and in this panel with clerks from 3 of the provinces, we are going to look at delving down a little more deeply into the practicalities of how one actually does that, because of course everything is rather easy in theory and sometimes a bit harder in practice. And today we're fortunate to be joined with clerks from 3 provinces. On the far side of the stage, Michelle DiEmanuele from Ontario, who is the Secretary of the Cabinet. In between, Sarah Thiele, the Clerk of the Executive Council of Manitoba. And nearest to me, Krista Quinlan, the Clerk of the Executive Council of Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm going to forego reading out all of their extensive and impressive bios. They are in the program for today, so we can get right into the meat of the discussion. And I'm going to lead off with a broad question on some of the biggest successes you've seen initially in moving toward making trade within Canada easier, faster, and more effective. And I'll throw it first to you, Krista.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. So thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important discussion. I'd just like to say that as we're starting out a conversation on internal trade barriers, it's critically important that we address this with ambition and with a clear-eyed view about what are the real impacts, the real outcomes that we're going to be expecting to achieve for Canadians. Let me begin by highlighting that we're seeing real energy across the country with respect to removing internal trade barriers and reducing internal trade barriers. And we applaud the collective effort of all of the jurisdictions on rising to meet this moment and take advantage of this opportunity to really change and shape trade within Canada. One of the clear success stories for us has been around labor mobility, and I would specifically identify it with respect to its application and value for the healthcare sector. Newfoundland and Labrador's Fair Registration Practices Act introduced legislated service standards and also enforcement tools that are going to accelerate credential recognition. And it has both timelines and teeth to ensure that we make an impact. It's focused on transparency, timeliness, and fairness so that we can encourage people to be able to be mobile within our province. With respect to infrastructure, I would think about the work with Quebec on the Churchill River project. So that stands out to me as a great example there. It's a clean energy partnership where both provinces could actually have used exceptions under the Canadian Free Trade Act agreement, but instead chose collaboration over protectionism. So that choice matters. Choice is the thing that's really important here. It's not what's bound within the agreements or in the documentation, it's the choosing to collaborate. When we're looking at nation building projects, it's important to make that choice to collaborate and not just look for excuses not to collaborate. So then I think I would just say, in closing, that there's momentum, but the key to sustaining that momentum is to focus on the tangible deliverables and focus on things that we can achieve for real outcomes so that they're not just something that looks good on paper.
Great points. Sarah, I'll turn to you.
Thank you. I'm going to come to my answer in a bit of a roundabout way and first talk about internal trade itself and its current, dare I say, trendiness. We've certainly talked about it often over the years, but it's suddenly become a bit of a panacea to address the much more significant elephant next door and what's happened with tariffs. So when we think about internal trade, I think it's just important to remember that it's a tool in a toolbox that's about diversifying our market and moving away from US markets where we need to. And it's not the only answer. And I'm saying that because I agree the momentum is very exciting and a lot has happened in a very short period of time that we'll talk about more. But we can't replace our US markets with Canadian ones, and we have to make sure that where we are working on internal trade, that we're working on it to address that most pressing problem. So what are the biggest opportunities for us? And a lot of the areas where we struggle with internal trade, it's not necessarily because there's a really big economic opportunity that we've failed to capture. That might be true in a few cases, and we want to really focus there. In a lot of cases, it's about social license, it's about environment, it's about recognizing the geographic differences between our provinces and ensuring that our provincial citizens have access to the level of service that they expect as Canadians. So all of those things are just important to keep in mind. In terms of wins, I'm going to answer it a little bit differently than Krista and not give specific examples. Instead, I'm going to talk in a broader way. One of the biggest exciting positive things that happened is just political will. The fact that we have all the premiers talking about this in a positive and productive way, MOUs are being signed, legislation is being tabled, everyone is collectively recognizing the opportunity. We know as public servants that when that window opens, and this was said earlier today in regards to talent, you have to jump through. So there's going to need to be some risk tolerance conversations, and we're going to have to just try it out in a few areas, work with our regulated professions, etc. But that positive shift around the political conversation is just so vitally important. The second area is a past success that I think is an excellent model as we look to move forward, and that's the New West Partnership Trade Agreement. So breaking down internal trade barriers is not new in Western Canada. We have a very effective agreement in place that has served us extremely well, and we've worked very well across the 4 Western provinces where we have market comparability. We have standards that are similar. Most people that live in Western Canada have lived in at least 2 of those provinces, if not all 4. And so the notion of accepting a standard from Alberta in Manitoba is not a very difficult step to take. And then I think the concept around reciprocity and these regional agreements and MOUs that are being signed, Ontario has taken a real leadership role in this space, and just acknowledging that if you're willing to accept my standard, I'm ready to accept yours. That's a very simple step forward that I think anyone can understand. It feels fair, and it allows us to move step by step in areas that matter. And then the last thing I will offer is the prioritization of Canadian procurement. We can't understate how critically important that is. The fact that governments at all levels are intentionally buying Canadian in and of itself breaks down internal trade barriers.
Great point.
First off, I need to just clarify something the Premier said. It's 3 words. It's faster, it's speed, and it's immediate. Just in case anybody was really wanting the story on that. I'm going to not repeat everything that was said here, but also not what the Premier said, because I think he really covered quite well the quick wins that we've certainly seen in the early days. I actually want to anchor on something else he said, which are the conditions for success. That's what's going to make this not a trend. If we can create the conditions for success, and he talked about what some of those things would be, then we've got a real chance to really change the trajectory on what has been something that's been talked about for decades. And so from my perspective, there's 4 critical wins that we've seen from that perspective. Number 1, leadership. Leadership at all levels. While the premiers and the Prime Minister and others get lots of credit at the political level, there's been leadership at many levels of this area, whether it's private sector, public sector, think tanks, et cetera. And you've seen that leadership coming together with a very strong voice aligned around we must act. The second condition for success has been, I believe, the work that has been done at the COF table with all the premiers, and the amount of dialogue that occurs between meetings now is quite substantive. I know in our case, our premier, if he hasn't talked to at least one premier in the course of a day, I'd be surprised. And as we know, several times in the last little while as we were building out some of the announcements and work that we're doing. And so what tended to be, whether it's at the First Minister's table or the Premier's tables, maybe a quarterly, biannual event, is now a relationship. And when you have a relationship, it's not just about cooperation. A relationship is where you're leaning in and you're saying, we're going to do something together. We're going to have a meaningful result of our time spent together. I think that's very different. I think the third thing is this concept of control. Spending time on what we actually have control over. And I won't quote the cheese and the cracker comment, but I will say that there are things we don't have control over. And so we have control over trade within our own boundaries, and we can affect that change, and we can make a difference, and we can use leadership and cooperation to have success. And so while we're trying to figure out the areas we don't control, it allows us to at least move the yardstick and have progress. And then the last thing I would say is, again, Premier Ford said this differently, but I'll say it this way, is let's not look for the big, huge pan-Canadian master agreement of all that everybody can sign on to, but then we've got exception after exception after exception after exception. We actually are building it piece by piece, brick by brick, substantively, strongly, and with great commitment to continuing to go find that next brick together. And that happens, as I said, at all levels, both elected and unelected. It's a very exciting time, and I think we all hold the end of that story as to whether or not it is a trend or a new way to do business.
Mm-hmm. And that sets the scene for a next question on what can we do to deepen those conditions for success and set priorities for moving further. Where do you see that, any of you, as your next priorities for action? Krista?
So, we're really looking at prioritizing identification of bottlenecks, clearing those bottlenecks. We're seizing on these long-standing conversations. Internal trade barriers is not new. We've been dealing with this my entire career within the Provincial Public Service for 25 years. One of the first products I was working on had to do with internal trade barriers. So we can seize on those long-standing strategic conversations, and we can focus on the tangible benefits. We can focus on dealing with the things that are going to have the most impact and the things that we can deal with in short term. We don't need to fix everything at the same time. We can pick the things that we're going to focus on and tailor a response and do it quickly. Businesses and workers are not working in a policy framework, they're working in real life, and we need to do things within governments to make them better and faster so that they can move forward more quickly. We need to move these long-standing strategic conversations into practical, measurable changes with an accelerated approach on things. Credential recognition is really, really important. We want to make sure that we're doing that. We want to make labor mobility frictionless. We need to embed that across the country so that workers can move where the work is when they're needed. And we want to make sure that we're all able to deal with those labor supply issues and labor mobility. Targeted regulatory work, I think, should be focused on key sectors. So not picking broad, policy topics that we'll never solve. Pick a thing that we want to work on that's going to have an impact on businesses and workers, and then dedicate some attention to that so that we can achieve it. We've had this regulatory reconciliation and cooperation table for many years. It's done great work. They've got 12 agreements, 17 different topics. They have a portal, so it's important for the stakeholders to give the feedback to those tables so they can understand the priority, they can understand the emerging priorities and the urgent issues that we need to deal with. Otherwise, we're just going to have our list of things that we're going to tick through over time, and it's not actually going to achieve something quickly. And then the last thing I just say is on the mutual recognition of regulatory measures related to the provision of goods. We're hoping to have that done. We want to make sure that by the end of the year, a good or service that can be sold in any province, that's eligible to be sold in any province, could go to any province or territory. Those are really important priorities.
I think
Terrific
you're going to
agenda.
hear a similar answer from all of us because it's classic implementation, and it goes to that pan-Canadian is not going to work. Where we've seen success is where we've done things locally or regionally, where they're tactical, they make sense to the public, and you can move on them. So that to me continues to be the next step, and a somewhat obvious one. The conversation around labor mobility, I think, is an area where we need to find a way to talk about it in a way that the average person understands and can buy into, because a lot of this, what we call red tape, didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of something that mattered to someone whose voice was heard, and so something was regulated. And that's especially true around labor mobility. There was a really interesting comment made in the talent panel again about the way that we protect our health professions, because there is a tendency for specialists to want to be with other specialists, to want to be where the research is happening, who want to be where they can build their skills, and that's very understandable. That is a massive challenge in rural, northern, remote areas where people are not going to want to get flown into Toronto for heart surgery. They want to be able to do that at home. So for us to be able to attract that kind of talent into provinces like Manitoba and elsewhere, we have to think carefully through this. Our nurses have different credentials because our nurses have to do things that they may not have to do in a large urban hospital. They have to do it in a small rural community because they're the only person there. And so talking about it in that way, where it's a real thing and people can consider, is it so important that we have absolute free labor mobility so people can move everywhere in order to drive the economy faster? Or is nursing credentialing, which is a very complex area of work, where we should focus our attention right now if this is about trade and about making our economy resilient with what's happening down south? So I think that next step is really, and I'm echoing Krista's remarks, it's really about honing in on, if we're going to talk about internal trade barriers, let's be very realistic about which ones we're talking about. Everyone loves to talk about alcohol. Manitoba has allowed direct alcohol sales for years. It's not held our own market back. We have excellent craft breweries. I highly recommend you check them out if you haven't yet. It's really helped to grow that market in our province. And so there are areas like that that are not nearly as difficult around that social license and ensuring adequate service to citizens that we can peel off, I think. And those tables have been doing this work for a long time, and they can continue to do it. The one other thing I'll put out there is there's lots of discussion around trucking regulation. And when you really dive into trucking regulation, a lot of it comes down to how each of us are able to maintain our highways. And I was really enjoying Premier Ford's comments about what's being invested in Ontario highways. It's triple the Manitoba economy. So we are not going to be able to offer Manitoba citizens quite the same level of highway infrastructure that Ontario might be able to. And so that then feeds into some of the challenges we have when negotiating trucking regulation. So some of those pieces and just having that more down-to-earth conversation, I think, is a very important next step.
So let me take a slightly different approach, although consistent, and then I want to come back to credentials because I have a couple of things maybe to spice it up a bit. Let me start by saying at the government implementation level, and I really from an implementation science perspective, we are highly structured vertically and somewhat horizontally. That has to shift almost like completely. because there's absolutely nothing that I work on that deals with these issues that doesn't cover multiple ministries. And we are operating very differently in Ontario today than we were even, say, 3 or 4 years ago. And so I think that is one of the things that if we want to deepen, we have to think about how we morph and change the way we structure bureaucracies. And I don't just mean a simple, let's be a matrix organization. It's much more complex than that. The second thing I would say is it then relates to actual implementation science, good old-fashioned rigor and discipline. I know across most of our organizations, I know in my own organization this morning, I was chatting with somebody, I have a fairly sophisticated delivery dashboard so I can keep an eye on things across a very large organization. And then I found out there are 402 other metrics that someone else is watching that have nothing to do with anything that we actually are trying to manage, measure, and deliver on. And so that kind of disconnectedness leads to a depletion of your energy and resources to focus on where you need to get to. Mark's looking at me. I know that dashboard. He helped me design it. And so that implementation component on where we are focusing our very limited resources has to be one that is far more sophisticated, disciplined, and enabled so that we can move our resources in a way that allow that deepening to occur. The last piece I just want to say as an approach is the risk tolerance piece. We all talk about it, risk tolerance, then some people will say, you know, we have to have a tolerance for failure. This is all kind of language we've spun around for years on. But the fact of the matter is why we're seeing what's happening right now happen is because we all feel at risk. In fact, many of us feel fearful about what's happening. And that has increased naturally our risk tolerance. And I can see it in, you know, we just introduced 2 fundamentally historical bills in Ontario around both trade and around a series of permitting and licensing approaches that we will now take that are so different than what we were doing previously. And the risk tolerance has changed, and we still have to keep people safe and protected, et cetera, but it's different. And how do we learn from this period in a way we did not in the COVID period, because we went back to a lot of things? We need to hardwire this and this new risk tolerance in a way where we actually need to make choices. We need to make choices as this new economy emerges. The last thing I just want to say is on credentialing. I ran a hospital for 12 years. I know a fair bit about nursing practice. It was a very large urban hospital, but we took care and we helped many other practice areas that were not maybe as fortunate to have resources the way we did. And I agree with you. If you are for example, a public health nurse is not the same as an acute care nurse, and they will not have the same level of exercise of their practice. So I agree with you on that front. The problem is we're using the very small number of exceptions to drive the norms. And so I know, because I know many of the great facilities and organizations in your province that deliver excellent health care, standards of practice and care and quality that rival anywhere in this country. That's where we can start. And then how do we then leverage that to help that nurse in that small remote area who's doing a PICC line and probably other interventions with medical direction that they wouldn't normally have to do in any other practice. There's a way to get at this, or trucking is another example. There's a way to get at these where we start looking at where the opportunities are, not the barriers. That's the kind of shifting and thinking that we have to have. I'll end by saying that one of the most important days in my career on this issue was with the Premier. And I had multiple decades of experience in and out of government. And the Premier said to me one day, as the cabinet submission was coming through and we were briefing him, he said, "Michelle, why is it that the risks and the pages of risks are always so much longer than the benefits?" Right? It was a real important moment. And we always start with that in the slide deck as we go into the details, right? And it was an important moment because in that moment, he was saying, We need to get all that information right. We need to understand all that information, and don't let what can stop us from thinking about what is possible. And that's the kind of thing that's going to help us deepen.
Well, we have only a little bit of time left, so I want to pick up on a couple comments around thinking about bigger possibility. Michelle, you mentioned we're likely not going to get a one-size-all big master agreement, and you also talked to the need to institutionalize this greater risk tolerance. So one thought as an international trade economist is that mutuality, mutual recognition, reciprocity is advancing us slowly, but it's not going to give us the big bang in terms of openness this existential crisis demands. What would it take to move beyond reciprocity and mutuality between the provinces and get provinces to simply open up, recognize all the other credentials, recognize other regulations that meet some minimum threshold?
Yeah, well, I think you heard the Premier say a couple of things. Number one, we got to get started, which is what this is doing. And let's not, just apropos what I just said, you told me a whole bunch of reasons why I might not be able to do something. I'm going to say, we're doing it. We're moving forward.
Yep.
We're going to create momentum and speed and muscle to continue to do that. But I'd also say the Premier talked about other things. It isn't just enough to do that. Where are the big things we are going to do together? A pipeline. He talked about a pipeline as just one of so many examples. Dale, we were talking this morning, my colleague from Alberta, we were talking this morning about the 3 or 4 things between East and West that we have so much common interest in. We are not at a loss for what we can do. The premiers, I do believe, are really working their way through where those next moves are. And I can tell you at the administrative level, our colleague John is here from the federal government, we are constantly working on these issues. I see Christian Fox here as well. I call you. If I don't think we can get something through, it's like, how do we do that? The level of conversation happening is regular, daily, thoughtful, and substantive. And that conversation will continue to yield for us those priorities that will advance us today, tomorrow, the next day. I was with our Arctic colleagues last night, and they reminded us, one foot in front of the other, each and every day. Let's just keep that momentum going, and we will take care of the rest, I believe.
I'd love a perspective from other parts of the country. Sarah?
We don't ever achieve much with public policy without political will. We can't forget that we operate in a political environment, and things like legislation, we are vertical, but we follow the rules. So there is, if that political will is there, this space of internal trade is fraught with individual small issues from a whole bunch of different voices. And if this conversation can be happening amongst people that are not experts in the area, that just understand, I'm comfortable that if I walk into a hospital, we'll keep going back to that example, anywhere in Canada, that I am going to get a similar level of service. I think we know that intuitively as Canadians to a degree, I hope. And so if that is true, and the public has an understanding of that, the political will is there, then all of those voices that may come out to protect their particular exception or need, I think we can have a substantive conversation and move forward. And then just picking up on Michelle's earlier comment, and it's implementation. One big example of a win, I think will really crack this egg open. So whether that is, the pipeline everyone talks about, whether it's Manitoba being able to make Churchill what it should be, Churchill is fraught with trade and regulatory challenges that John and I will certainly be talking about soon. And that's a massive opportunity that crosses multiple provinces. So something like that, it doesn't have to be that big all-in agreement, but one big all-in project that demonstrates what is possible. And maybe we loosen a whole bunch of regulation for that one thing, see what happens, because we do tend to stop when we note a potential risk instead of noting the risk and mitigating it accordingly, which is really how we should be conducting ourselves at all times. So there is lots of potential here, and I just don't want to underestimate the power of the political will we have right now.
Krista, the last words with you.
Last word. So I think I would just say that while commitments and frameworks are important, we have to keep our eyes steadily fixed on what matters most, and that's achieving those results. You know, we are at a moment of momentum for internal trade in this country. We must seize that opportunity, but we need to work together on the priorities that are common for us. My province is really focused on infrastructure. We think that access, physical barriers to trade are something that have to be dealt with immediately. And if we're looking at things like, you know, the East-West pipeline, we're looking at new electricity transmission, we're looking at road infrastructure, we're looking at intermodal links, we're looking at ferry rates, we're looking at bridge tolls. All of these things need to be dealt with in order to open up the corridors that we need to see to take full advantage of the potential for this country.
That sets a great tone, particularly given, you know, to remind all of us, the IMF estimates that the cost of our internal trade barriers amount to a 22% effective tariff on trade between our provinces. They add 14% to the costs of goods and services, and they shave about 4% off GDP. If we can make good on all of these great ideas, we more than compensate for everything happening south of the border. So thank you for setting that agenda.